Strategic leadership. Strategic leadership is the ability to influence others to voluntarily make decisions that enhance the prospects for the organization's long-term success while maintaining short-term financial stability. Different leadership approaches impact the vision and direction of growth and the potential success of an organization. To successfully deal with change, all executives need the skills and tools for both strategy formulation and implementation. Managing change and ambiguity requires strategic leaders who not only provide a sense of direction but who can also build ownership and alignment within their workgroups to implement change. Processes. Strategic leadership provides techniques that focus organizations when they are deciding on their purpose and best business practices that are critical for remaining competitive and relevant. Being able to learn and adapt has become vital for sustainability. Failure to be able to adapt to changing technology, climate change, and economic factors risks the organization becoming obsolete. Remaining successful requires a different way of thinking about how to marshal the resources and deliver services. Strategic leadership balances a focused analytical perspective with the human dimension of strategy making as documented by the Park-Lie Group. It is important to engage the entire business in a strategic dialogue in order to lay the foundation for building winning organizations that can define, commit, adjust, and adapt their strategy quickly as needed. Strategy execution. The analytical dimension and the human dimension. Leaders face the continuing challenge of how they can meet the expectations of those who placed them there. Addressing these expectations usually takes the form of strategic decisions and actions. For a strategy to succeed, the leader must be able to adjust it as conditions require. But leaders cannot learn enough, fast enough, and do enough on their own to effectively adapt the strategy and then define, shape, and execute the organizational response. If leaders are to win, they must rely on the prepared minds of employees throughout the organization to understand the strategic intent and then both carry out the current strategy and adapt it in real time. The challenge is not only producing a winning strategy at a point in time, but getting employees smart enough and motivated enough to execute the strategy and change it as conditions change. This requires the leader to focus as much on the process used to develop the strategy, the human dimension, as the content of the strategy, the analytical dimension. General approaches. Leaders recognize the need to incorporate aspects of both the analytical and human dimensions to effectively drive the organization forward, but how this insight translates into action varies significantly from leader to leader. These differences are largely driven by the bias leaders have for how they divide their time between the two dimensions. This bias is reflected in how leaders answer questions such as the following. What is their primary role as a chief strategist? What is their job as a leader during ongoing strategy making? What type of team should their strategy making create? When is strategy making finished? How leaders answer these questions will ultimately impact their ability to deliver a winning strategy because their responses indicate whether and how they build and lead an organization. Question 1. What is their primary role as a chief strategist? Should the focus be on being the architect of the strategy product or being the architect of the strategy process? Is their primary job to come up with the right strategy, or is it to manage a process to achieve this outcome? Analytical. From an analytical perspective, the chief strategist's job is to be the architect of the perfect strategy product. Leaders holding this perspective see the strategy itself as the outcome, and managing the process is either ignored or delegated, frequently to individuals who lack line of sight to the senior person. Their concerns center on organizing and mastering the data, developing the arguments, and looking for that burst of insight that will drive the organization's competitive advantage and provide the foundation for future success. Human. Answering the same question from the perspective of the human dimension, the chief strategist's job is to be the architect of the perfect strategy process. Leaders holding this perspective see the process as the primary outcome, and the product, while important, can and should be built by others. There is a recognition that the product will necessarily evolve, so the more important endpoint is to build the capacity for strategic thinking across the group so that change, when it occurs, can be absorbed more quickly and more completely. Question 2. What is their job as a leader during ongoing strategy making? Linked to the first question, this second question focuses on how leaders conceptualize their role as they participate in the ongoing strategy process. Is it to provide bold, clear leadership that elicits confidence in their personal capabilities as hero, or is it to serve as a coach and guide who enables others to perform and stand in the limelight? Analytical leaders feel the need to personally come up with the right answer. If they are to be the leader, they must be the ones with the solutions. They feel obligated to lead from the front on strategic issues, demonstrating expertise through business insights and customer knowledge, skillfully outsmarting the competition, and outguessing the marketplace. These leaders are seen as visionary. These leaders view themselves as coaches or guides, believing that the organization's strategy is only as good as the breadth and depth of the understanding and commitment that it attracts. Responsibility for developing the strategy is widely dispersed but carefully coordinated. These leaders focus on guiding and responding while building commitment and empowerment among those building the strategy. Question 3. What type of team should their strategy making create? This third question recognizes that every strategy process defines a community and creates a team. This is true whether the leader is aware of it or not, and whether the leader manages it or not. The question being asked is, does the strategy making create an exclusive club of capable thinkers, or create a broad base of ownership and commitment leading to a sense of citizenship across a much larger group? The analytical approach to strategy creates an exclusive inner circle of thinkers who are in the know and make most of the decisions. Being part of this group feels good because it is similar to being part of a private society. The common element that binds society members together is their close-knit exclusiveness and the extraordinary access and understanding of the data and thinking that leads to the strategy. This smaller group is well versed in the views of the leader and the data and knows how the different pieces of the strategy fit together. A leader focusing on the human dimension is concerned about building a sense of citizenship among a much larger group of people. It is built around a process that invites much broader participation and relies on input from many others outside of the top team. The aim is to create a sense of belonging and ownership across the organization. In this situation, many more people feel they can have an informed opinion about the overall strategy. They believe they have been part of its development and that they can influence the outcome. In that sense, it is their strategy. Question 4. When is strategy making finished? Most leaders have an idea of how strategy making and time are related. The question being asked is strategy making as a discrete set of sequential activities with a defined start and stop? At its essence, the question is in the organization, is the strategy process fundamentally linear with a defined beginning and end, or is it fundamentally iterative with no defined endpoint? From the analytical view, good strategy making follows a linear process with each task being checked off as it is completed. As set out in many strategy texts, it is a set of reasonably well-defined steps leading to a fully formed plan of execution. Effectively, the strategy is set for a defined time period and executed. Leaders who lean to the human dimension see strategy as a continuing work in process, something that is more free-flowing, never truly complete, but continuously being shaped as interactions occur with customers and competitors and as new issues and knowledge emerge from the people throughout the organization. They are comfortable circling back on key ideas and frequently will drive the strategy process to revisit critical assumptions and, based on the insights gained, alter course. For these individuals, changes in strategy are markers of leadership success, not leadership failure. Incorporating both analytical and human dimensions, to integrate both dimensions into strategy making in a way that creates a winning outcome and gets the whole organization understanding and committed to this common agenda requires leaders who are clear about the strategic cup. The steps described below are intended to provide the leader with techniques to do that. Taken collectively, they define a process that incorporates both the analytical and human dimensions while challenging individuals throughout the organization to raise the quality and quantity of their strategic thinking. Standardize vocabulary and agree on a toolset. Strategy making that enlists large groups of employees needs a common vocabulary and a common set of tools in order to be effective. Deciding on a vocabulary is not difficult, but it does need to be done with intent and with a sense of discipline. The number of terms that get used during strategy making seems at times almost endless and includes such words as vision, mission, fact base, KPI, goal, objective, scorecard, driver, strategic action plan, strategic issue analysis, governing principle, and metric, to name a few. Establishing a common vocabulary begins and ends by getting alignment around three questions. What does X mean? Why and when is it used? And is X necessary in developing the strategy and building understanding and ownership for it over time? Closely linked to the need for a common vocabulary is the need for a common set of frameworks or tools to build your strategy. In many cases, toolsets come with their own embedded vocabulary. Some leaders use relatively more elaborate tools such as shareholder value at SVA, computer modeling, and scenario planning. Other leaders tend toward simplicity. Jack Welch described his toolset as a series of 5 questions with the answers ultimately leading up to what he called the big aha. His 5 questions included: what does the playing field look like now? What has the competition been up to? What have we been up to? What's around the corner? What is our winning move? There is a great deal of useful vocabulary and many fine tool sets in the strategy marketplace and no shortage of advocates for one or another of these. The important outcome is that the leader, as the executive leading the strategy process, needs to select a vocabulary and a tool set, use it consistently over time, and require others in the senior and middle ranks of the organization to do the same. Finally, when deciding what vocabulary and toolset are best to use while working across large populations, simpler is usually better. The simpler the language and the fewer the tools, the more accessible the strategy becomes to larger groups of people, and the more people can understand it, know how they should think and talk about it, and identify how they can contribute. Some situations require more sophisticated, i.e., more complicated tools because there is a need for much more thorough analytics. Many do not. The right balance point between comprehensiveness and simplicity will provide enough analytical complexity. Simplicity, where it can be found, makes a significant difference when working across a large population. Broaden and strengthen senior managers as a strategic leadership team. Broadening and strengthening the team at the senior levels of the organization begins with an objective assessment of whether there actually is a working strategy currently in place and, if there is, the state of understanding and ownership for it in the organization. The lack of clarity and ownership deeper in the organization leads to misallocated resources because people are working at cross purposes, to excessive leadership time spent correcting and clarifying the direction because others are not convinced or they fail to understand it, and 3, poor execution of the strategy due to diffuse and differing priorities. Perhaps most importantly, it directly impacts organizational agility because there is no broad understanding and agreement on the current strategy, so subsequent changes to the strategy make no more sense than the original agenda. Leaders can address these dynamics by broadening out the understanding and ownership of the strategy to a much larger group without sacrificing the sense of commitment at the top of the organization. Having this larger group of managers accountable for successfully defining and executing a strategy is not only critical to building winning strategies, but if done in a way that includes both the analytical and the human dimensions, it is incredibly energizing for the organization. This is especially true in those cultures and organizations where the decision-making is traditionally held more closely by a relatively small group of senior people. The mechanics of how to broaden the senior team will vary depending on cultural and organizational considerations. The key is to create a common context for both the what and the why of the strategy that serves as a critical touchstone for the broader leadership team. In most cases, the process creates a group of 50, 100 or more people who recognize that they are collectively accountable for the success of the entire strategy and not just their piece of it. These steps lay the foundation for partnering with the middle of the organization by setting the stage for the senior team to speak with one voice to the middle managers. Build a strategy support team to serve as champions for the strategy process. With varying degrees of success, many leaders get their strategy making to this point and either stop or their process stalls. A major reason is the lack of understanding and commitment to the steps required to build more effective strategic leadership practices and a strategic dialogue in the operating groups below the senior managers. These groups, and especially their leadership teams, frequently do not know how to proceed, and there is no consistent in-house resource to assist them. The net effect is the sense of excitement and momentum that was generated at the top of the house in the earlier stages of the strategy process is lost, and the strategy team of employees is derailed before it even gets started. One of the best ways to address this is to identify and train a cadre of high-potential line managers in the middle of the organization that can serve as champions of the strategy process to those both above and below them. In this sense, they serve both as a catalyst for the process and as a bridge between formulation and implementation. They do not replace the leadership role of the senior teams in each of these operating groups, but they do serve as a critical additional resource that is dedicated to creating momentum and fostering consistency. This can be especially important if the strategy defined requires changes in the organizational culture as well as the business model. This resource also helps to ensure that the day-to-day running the business is not neglected as the demands of building a large-scale strategy dialogue come into play. The makeup of this strategy support team SST generally includes one or more people from each of the operating groups, usually 2-3 downs from the senior person. The skills and behaviors required of these individuals are a blend of both the analytical and the human dimensions. Too much emphasis on one dimension over the other undermines the effectiveness of the role. In partnership with the senior team from their operating group, the members of the SST serve as a coach and guide for the strategy process as it unfolds. In this capacity, they reinforce expectations and teach methods for building and sustaining a strategy dialogue in their respective groups, ensure that the local strategy product being produced is of a uniform quality, including vocabulary and tools, and foster behavioral and organizational alignment over time. Additional roles for these individuals might also include facilitator, tracker and chaser, success and failure transfer agent across the businesses, and writer when required. In addition to serving as a resource to those around them, it is a unique opportunity of the SST members to participate in the strategy discussion 2-3 levels above their normal level of discourse. It is also an excellent training ground for those involved, and it gives the senior executive direct access to the middle of the organization while observing the performance of these high-potential line managers. Raise the bar for more effective strategic leadership in the middle of the organization. For many middle managers, participating effectively in the strategy development process is as much a question of training as it is doing. Building understanding and skills on topics such as the vocabulary and toolset marketplace dynamics and the associated ambiguity, strategy storytelling, and their own individual strategic leadership strengths and weaknesses are all aspects of a process that can ignite a sense of understanding and commitment. A key insight that drives this outcome is the recognition that most middle managers, regardless of cultural background, want to commit to something and belong to something that is more than who they are as individuals. It is the leader's job to give managers the opportunities in which they can make such commitments. In all instances, providing the settings for these individuals includes asking them to be storytellers of the organizational strategy to those around them. Doing this requires these middle managers to understand and embrace both the analytical and human dimensions of the strategy making. It also creates a much smarter and more prepared middle manager that has publicly committed to the strategy and is in a much stronger position to make local decisions as the strategy evolves. Localize the strategy story at the lower levels of the organization and engage these levels with the question, what does this mean for me and my team? While frontline supervisors and their teams in most instances are the largest portion of the population, the strategy-making work to be done with this group is relatively simple. Their needs center largely on context, community, and clarity. Engaging this group in a discussion of the basic business model and the organizational strategy provides critical context and gives meaning to their work. Their participation in shaping the local strategy builds understanding and ownership and a sense of partnership with the larger organization. Strategy making with this group begins with the organization's strategy story. Using middle managers in this role allows these individuals to raise their own strategic leadership bar. And it is through these middle managers that the organizational story becomes more accessible in those settings and situations that they know much more intimately than senior managers. Ultimately, the strategy only comes alive and communities are built when it is used to set the broad context and is followed by a much more detailed local discussion addressing the question, what does this mean for me and my team? The combination of the analytical and human dimensions applied to this group provides a platform of understanding among the rank and file for what the strategy is, what it means to them, and why it needs to continue to evolve over time. This in turn increases the willingness of this critically important but difficult to reach population to recognize the inevitable changes in strategy as markers of leadership success rather than leadership failure, and in the process. Moving the we/they line,